As my mother-in-law tapped her silver gavel to tally the votes that would end my marriage, she still believed I was just a penniless IT girl who had tricked her son into a life of charity. She did not know about the hidden slide in my presentation where the blue line of my net worth crossed double her son's gray line before the first course was even cleared. Evelyn Sterling gasped, her hand clutching her pearls as she collapsed back into her velvet chair. She never calculated that I wasn't begging to stay in her world. I had already bought the shell company currently foreclosing on her beloved penthouse. My name is Isabella, and as I sat at the foot of that cold, ivory-inlaid table, I realized that the only thing separating me from a social sacrifice was the code I'd written in the dark. The air inside the Sterling's private island estate smelled of aged scotch, expensive sea salt, and the distinct metallic tang of a long-planned betrayal. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlantic howled, whipping the ocean into a black froth that matched the mood inside the dining room. We were isolated, miles from the mainland, gathered for what Evelyn Sterling termed a family loyalty vote. No outsiders were present. This was a clinical extraction. I looked down at the untouched crystal glass of sparkling water in front of me. The liquid was still and reflective, much like the eyes of the dozen Sterlings surrounding me, people who viewed me as a line item they could no longer afford to carry. I was 35 years old, a woman who had spent 5 years being the quiet genius behind their survival, yet to them, I was just a weed to be pruned. I had stayed because of a loyalty tax, hoping Julian would finally choose my light over his mother's shadow. But as I watched him avoid my gaze, his hand hovering over a ballot he'd already marked for my exile, I realized the love had been dead for a long time. They thought they were holding a trial. They didn't realize they were attending a bankruptcy hearing for their own empire. I learned early on that the world is built by people who are never seen. My father was a janitor at the Sterling Heights corporate offices, a man who moved through the hallways like a ghost, emptying wastebaskets and buffing marble floors until they mirrored the faces of men who wouldn't look him in the eye. I spent my childhood in the shadow of those skyscrapers, waiting in the basement boiler rooms while he finished his shifts. It was there, amidst the hum of industrial heaters and the smell of floor wax, that I found my first discarded manual, Introduction to C++. To the Sterlings, that book was trash. To me, it was a map to a world where my name wouldn't be defined by the grime on my fingernails. I learned to code by the moonlight that filtered through the basement's high, narrow windows, typing lines of logic into a refurbished laptop that had a cracked screen and a dying battery. I vowed then that I would never be invisible again. I would build systems so complex and so essential that the world would have no choice but to recognize the architect. By the time I was 25, I had realized that wealth wasn't just about money, it was about information and the silence you kept while gathering it. I didn't want the spotlight, I wanted the control. I worked 12-hour shifts as a junior developer by day, and by night, I was a ghost in the machine, building a proprietary algorithm that predicted market shifts before they even registered on a ticker tape. I lived on coffee and ambition, stacking my wins in offshore accounts and shell companies, hiding my growing empire behind a wall of digital anonymity. When I met Julian, he saw a modest software architect with a quiet demeanor and a steady job. He saw someone who would fit into the Sterling aesthetic without causing a ripple. He didn't see the woman who had already acquired a 3% stake in his family's competitors. He didn't see the daughter of the man who used to clean his father's office. I let him believe the lie. I let the code of silence be my armor. I allowed the Sterlings to treat me like a lucky interloper, a charity case who had managed to climb the social ladder through a wedding ring. Every time Evelyn Sterling made a comment about my simple background or mocked the boring IT work I didn't argue. I just went back to my laptop and executed another trade. Every insult was a line of code in the program I was writing for their downfall. I was the silent architect, reinforcing my own foundation while I watched the Sterlings let theirs rot from the inside out. They thought they were the ones who held the power because they owned the land, but they forgot the lesson I learned in those boiler rooms. The person who understands how the building works is the only one who can truly bring it down. I had spent 35 years learning to be seen only when I chose to be, and as I sat at that ivory-inlaid table, the moonlight finally hitting the screen of my laptop, I knew the time for invisibility was over. The ghost was about to become the owner. Meeting Julian felt, at first, like a glitch in my own logic. He was a man of soft edges and inherited confidence, someone who walked through the world as if every door was pre-programmed to open for him. I met him during a system migration at Sterling Global. I was the lead architect tasked with fixing their antiquated servers, and he was the director of innovation, a title that was as decorative as the crown molding in his office. He was captivated by my focus, by the way I looked at a wall of code and saw a narrative. He called it brilliance. I knew it was just survival. But for a moment, I let myself believe that a Sterling could actually see the daughter of a janitor as an equal. The illusion shattered the first time he brought me home to the Sterling estate for their monthly Sunday standard dinner. The house was a monument to old money, a limestone fortress in the Hamptons that looked down on the Atlantic with a cold, aristocratic disdain. Evelyn Sterling didn't greet me at the door. She waited in the drawing room, framed by a portrait of an ancestor who looked like he'd never performed a day of physical labor in his life. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my shoes, my wrists, and the way I carried my handbag. She was scanning me for a pedigree she already knew I didn't have. "Julian, darling," she said, her voice like a velvet-covered blade. "You didn't mention your little friend was coming for the formal dinner. I'm afraid the table is set for 12, and we have the senator's family arriving any moment." Julian shifted his weight, the first sign of the cowardice that would eventually define our marriage. "Mom, Isabella is with me. We can just add a chair." Evelyn gave a soft, tinkling laugh that chilled the marrow in my bones. "Nonsense. The symmetry would be ruined, and we simply don't have enough of the Romanov silverware polished. But Isabella, dear, you look like a girl who understands the value of hard work." She turned to a passing maid, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Maria, take Miss Isabella, isn't it? Take her to the kitchen. There's plenty of the lobster bisque left, and she can sit with the staff. I'm sure she'll feel much more at home in the heart of the house than in the gallery." I felt the blood rush to my face, a heat that was half humiliation and half recognition. Julian didn't roar. He didn't pull me to his side and leave. He squeezed my hand, a silent plea for me to be gracious, and let his mother lead him toward the grand dining room. I was led through a swinging green baize door into the kitchen, the very environment my father had spent his life cleaning. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the frantic energy of service. The staff looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. I sat at a small, scarred wooden table in the corner, a bowl of bisque placed in front of me like an afterthought. I didn't cry. Tears are a waste of resources, a leak in a pressurized system. Instead, I pulled out my phone. While the Sterlings toasted to their own greatness in the other room, I opened my secure trading terminal. I looked at the Sterling Global stock price. It was bloated, riding on a wave of sentiment rather than actual growth. I saw the vulnerabilities in their quarterly projections that even their CFO hadn't spotted yet. Every clink of silver on china from the dining hall was a reminder of the standard they thought I couldn't meet. As I ate the cold soup, I placed a quiet, aggressive short position against one of their primary subsidiaries. If Evelyn Sterling wanted me in the kitchen with the people who actually made the house run, I would show her how easily a house could be dismantled from the inside out. I wasn't just a guest she could discard, I was the variable she couldn't account for. By the time the main course was served upstairs, I had earned more in market fluctuations than Julian would earn in a year of his innovation salary. I realized then that the Sterlings didn't own me, they just owned the furniture. And furniture can always be liquidated. The legal trap was sprung 6 months into my marriage, served not on a silver platter, but across a desk of cold glass in the Sterling family's private legal chambers. Julian sat beside me, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere above my left shoulder, his hand limp in mine. Across from us, Evelyn didn't look like a mother-in-law, she looked like a sovereign defending her borders. She pushed a thick stack of vellum toward me, the amended prenuptial agreement. Standard maintenance, Isabella, Evelyn said, her voice smooth and devoid of heat. We've realized the original document was incomplete. As a Sterling, your efforts are now part of the Sterling brand. This simply ensures that any hobbies or side projects you engage in are properly sheltered within the family trust. I scanned the legalese, my eyes darting to the clauses highlighted in my mind like red-flagged code. It wasn't just a shelter, it was an annexation. The contract stated that any intellectual property, patents, or software architectures developed by me during the duration of the marriage would automatically become the sole property of the Sterling Trust. They weren't just trying to own my presence at their dinner table, they were trying to harvest my mind. They saw my talent as a natural resource to be strip-mined, a way to modernize their crumbling real estate empire with tech they didn't understand and couldn't build themselves. Isabella, it's just for the legacy, Julian whispered, finally looking at me with eyes full of a terrifying, hollow sincerity. Mom says it protects us both. If you build something great, the Sterling name ensures it reaches the right people. I looked at him and saw the tragedy of the golden boy, a man so accustomed to living in a gilded cage that he couldn't imagine why anyone would want the key. He didn't see the theft, he saw a promotion. I reached for the pen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But as I touched the cold metal of the barrel, my internal logic took over. I was a software architect. I knew how to build backdoors into every system I designed. If Evelyn wanted a contract, I would give her a ghost. I signed the document with a flourish, my hand perfectly steady. Evelyn's smile was triumphant, the look of a woman who had just successfully closed a hostile takeover. She didn't know that 3 weeks prior, I had restructured my primary holdings into a complex web of blind trusts and offshore corporations based in jurisdictions that didn't recognize the marital property laws of New York. The intellectual property she thought she was securing didn't belong to Isabella Vance, it belonged to Aegis Systems, a legal entity with 1,000 layers of encryption between its assets and the Sterling name. As the notary stamped the final page, I felt a strange, cold clarity. I had just signed away a version of myself that didn't exist, a paper doll they could play with while the real Isabella continued to build her fortress in the dark. Evelyn tucked the contract into her leather folder, believing she had tethered me to her whim forever. She didn't realize that by trying to steal my future, she had freed me from any lingering sense of loyalty to her present. I walked out of that office 10 pounds lighter. I was no longer a wife trying to fit into a family. I was a double agent in a house of cards. Every line of code I wrote from that day forward wouldn't be a contribution to the Sterling legacy, it would be a nail in its coffin. They wanted my mind, but they had only captured a shadow. The ghost contract was signed, and the real war had finally begun. While the Sterlings slept in their high-thread count sheets, dreaming of legacies they hadn't earned, I sat in the blue light of my basement office, building the engine of their destruction. The ghost contract had been the catalyst. If they wanted to own my mind, I would make sure my mind was a labyrinth they could never navigate. I launched Aegis Systems not with a press release or a celebratory gala, but with a series of silent, encrypted pings to servers located in jurisdictions the Sterling lawyers couldn't find on a map. I was the silent architect, and my masterpiece was a wall of financial mirrors. To Evelyn, I was still the modest daughter-in-law who spent too much time on her little IT projects. She would occasionally perform what she called wellness audits, dropping by our apartment to look through my bank statements with a condescending hum. She saw a steady, uninspiring salary and a few sensible savings accounts. What she didn't see was the cascading waterfall of capital moving through the shell companies I'd named after the stars. Lyra Holdings, Cygnus Tech, Orion Capital, they were invisible entities, each one a layer of armor protecting my real growth. My startup was a disruptive force in automated logistics, a software suite that optimized supply chains with an efficiency that made the Sterling's old-world real estate management look like a horse and buggy in a world of jet engines. I was acquiring contracts from the very competitors the Sterlings feared most, but my name was nowhere on the letterhead. I was a ghost, a shadow, a variable that didn't exist in their ledger. Every time I sat at their dinner table, Listening to them drone on about their sterling standard, I was secretly approving multi-million-dollar acquisition rounds on my phone beneath the tablecloth. The emotional tax of the marriage was high, but the dividends were higher. Julian became a stranger who shared my bed, a man who spoke in his mother's cadence and looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. He thought I was drifting, unaware that I was actually soaring. He would offer me allowances for clothes or jewelry, and I would accept them with a hollow thank you, immediately diverting the funds into a high-risk crypto hedge that fueled my next server expansion. I was building a fortress out of their condescension. The most dangerous part was the sterling trust audit. Once a year, Evelyn's personal accountants would scour the finances of every family member to ensure brand alignment. I prepared for it like a grandmaster preparing for a title match. I created a simulated digital footprint of a struggling, mid-tier professional, complete with believable credit card debt and a modest 401k. I fed them the data they expected to see, a narrative of a woman who was just barely keeping her head above water without the sterling life raft. As the lead auditor closed his laptop and nodded to Evelyn, giving me a dismissive glance that said I was no threat, I felt a surge of cold, electric triumph. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't see the woman sitting right in front of them was already wealthier than their entire decaying dynasty. I was the architect of a new world, and they were still trying to collect rent on the old one. The walls were up, the systems were live, and the Sterlings were invited to a party they didn't know was their own wake. The betrayal didn't arrive with a scream or a grand confession, it leaked out of a spreadsheet during a routine security audit of our joint household accounts. I had built a subroutine, a watchdog script designed to flag any unusual volatility in our shared expenses. I expected to find a few over-budget dinners or perhaps a high-end watch Julian hadn't mentioned. Instead, the screen flared red with a series of systematic, recurring transfers, money moving out of our future and into a black hole I didn't recognize. As a software architect, I know that numbers never lie, even when people do. I spent the night tracing the digital breadcrumbs, my fingers flying across the keys in the cold, blue light of the office. The destination was an entity called Sterling Grace LLC. On the surface, it looked like a standard property management firm. But as I peeled back the layers of encryption and shell registration, the truth was uglier. It was a personal slush fund used by Evelyn Sterling to mask the hemorrhaging losses from her failed real estate gambles in the mid-market commercial sector. Julian hadn't just been helping his mother, he had been siphoning the capital from our joint savings, money I had contributed to under the guise of our shared goals, to pay the interest on Evelyn's predatory bridge loans. He was liquidating our security to preserve her pride. While I was building an empire in the shadows to protect us, he was dismantling our foundation to keep his mother's vanity afloat. Every dollar I had saved by skipping luxuries, every hour I had spent working late to secure our life, was being fed into the furnace of Evelyn's incompetence. I sat back, the monitor reflecting in my glasses like a digital autopsy. I felt a strange, surgical detachment. The man I had married, the one who claimed to value our independence, was secretly acting as a financial mule for a woman who viewed me as an interloper. He was terrified of her disapproval, so he chose to steal from his wife instead of standing up to his mother. He was choosing the sterling legacy over the sterling reality. I looked at the total amount, nearly $400,000 over 3 years. It was a gift of debt I had never agreed to carry. In that moment, the last lingering thread of my loyalty tax snapped. I realized that Julian wasn't a partner, he was a liability. He was a bug in the code that was threatening to crash the entire system. If I stayed, his cowardice would eventually bleed me dry, no matter how much I built. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply opened a new encrypted window and initiated a protocol I had hoped I would never need. I began poisoning the well. I created a series of mirrored accounts that made our joint balance look healthy to his casual gaze, while I silently moved my actual liquid assets into an ironclad trust he couldn't touch. I let him keep siphoning the crumbs I left behind, watching as he unknowingly led himself and his mother toward a financial cliff. He thought he was saving her empire. He didn't realize he was just making sure they were both on the ship when I finally pulled the plug. The betrayal was complete, and now, so was my resolve. Evelyn Sterling's arrogance was her greatest blind spot. She truly believed that money was a blunt instrument that could solve any social irritation. She decided that if she couldn't break my spirit at the dinner table, she would break my livelihood. She didn't know that while she was playing checkers with her husband's dwindling reputation, I had already rewritten the rules of the entire game. The move started with a casual lunch invitation at the Metropolitan Club. I sat across from her, playing the part of the weary employee, making sure to mention how much I valued my position at Aegis Systems and how much I feared the upcoming restructuring. I saw the predatory gleam in her eyes, the same look she gave a distressed property before she stripped it of its architectural dignity. She saw an opening to pull the rug out from under me, to leave me unemployed and entirely dependent on the sterling charity she so loved to hold over my head. 48 hours later, my internal system flagged a massive, unsolicited buyout offer for Aegis Systems. The offer came through a sterling-affiliated private equity firm, bloated with a 20% premium over market value. Evelyn was using the last of the family's liquid reserves, money they desperately needed to cover their own debt, to buy a company just so she could have the satisfaction of personally signing my termination papers. It was a kamikaze mission disguised as a power move. I sat in my office, watching the legal documents move through my secure portal. To Evelyn's lawyers, they were negotiating with a faceless board of directors in a tax haven. They didn't realize that every counteroffer they received was being typed by the very woman Evelyn planned to humiliate. I let them sweat. I let them increase the offer twice more, bleeding their capital dry as they chased the shadow of a victory. The day the deal was set to close, Evelyn showed up at our apartment unannounced, wearing a suit that cost more than my father's first house. She didn't offer a greeting, she offered a smirk. "Isabella, dear, I have some news that might be difficult for you. Your little company is under new management. Effective immediately, your position has been eliminated. I thought it best you heard it from family." I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. I simply opened my laptop and turned the screen toward her. It wasn't a termination notice. It was a shareholder registry. At the very top, listed as the 70% majority owner of Aegis Systems and all its subsidiaries, was my name. "You didn't buy my employer, Evelyn," I said, my voice as cold as a server room. "You just handed over $20 million in cash to the person you were trying to fire. You didn't check the cap table because you didn't think a janitor's daughter could be at the top of it. Thank you for the liquidity. I was looking for a reason to sell off the less profitable divisions, and you just overpaid for all of them." The color didn't just drain from her face, it seemed to evaporate. She looked at the screen, then at me, her mouth working but no sound coming out. She had just used the last of the sterling's war chest to buy a hollowed-out shell of a company from me. I wasn't just her employee, I was the person who had just legally and professionally fleeced her. The corporate sabotage had backfired with a clinical, mathematical finality. I wasn't the weed being pruned, I was the forest fire she had accidentally started in her own backyard. The failure of Evelyn's buyout attempt had done more than just humiliate her, it had triggered a massive, hidden seismic shift in the sterling's financial topography. By overextending the family's remaining liquid reserves to purchase what she thought was my employer, she had inadvertently pulled the last support beam from their own crumbling house. I watched the data feeds like a hawk. Within 48 hours of the wire transfer hitting my account, the Sterling Heritage Group tripped a debt service covenant on their primary asset, the family's ancestral estate and the flagship skyscraper that bore their name. As a software architect, I understood the power of a master key, the single line of code or the specific administrative privilege that grants total control over a system. In the world of old money real estate, the master key isn't held by the person whose name is on the deed, it's held by the bank that owns the debt. And the Sterlings were in a secret, terminal liquidity crisis. I didn't wait for them to recover. I called a meeting with the head of distressed assets at Global Union Bank, the primary lien holder for the Sterling holdings. I arrived not as Isabella Vance, the daughter-in-law they pitted, but as the managing director of Orion Capital, the largest of my shell entities. The bankers didn't care about my background or my marriage, they cared about the fact that I was offering to purchase the Sterling's non-performing notes at par, in cash, with a closing window of 6 hours. They're a legacy client, the banker had noted, his voice trailing off as he looked at the proof of funds on my screen. Legacy doesn't pay interest, I replied, my voice as flat as a digital dial tone. And right now, their legacy is a liability. You want the risk off your books. I want the control. The transaction was executed with the clinical precision of a surgical strike. By 4 p.m., I had signed the documents that made Orion Capital the primary creditor for the Sterling family. I was no longer just the woman they ignored at dinner, I was their landlord. I held the mortgage to the very bedroom where Evelyn slept in the skyscraper where Julian spent his days pretending to innovate. I went home that evening and found Julian in the living room, staring at a stack of past due notices he thought he had hidden from me. He looked smaller than usual, the weight of his mother's pride finally beginning to crush his spine. He still didn't know I knew about the $400,000 he'd siphoned. He didn't know that the money he'd funneled to save her had actually been the final spark that blew up their engine. Isabella, he said, his voice trembling. Things are a little tight right now. Mom had some unexpected expenses with a business acquisition. We might need to look into a bridge loan. I sat down across from him, pouring myself a glass of water, watching the way the light refracted through the crystal, the same crystal Evelyn had once told me I wasn't refined enough to handle. A bridge loan sounds complicated, Julian. Are you sure you can afford the interest? We're Sterlings, he snapped, a flash of his mother's misplaced arrogance flickering in his eyes. Someone will always lend us money. I smiled then, a small, sharp movement of my lips. You're right. Someone already did. I felt the master key in my pocket, the digital confirmation that the debt was mine. I wasn't just a part of the family anymore, I was the one who owned the roof over their heads. They had spent years trying to find a way to sever me from their trust, never realizing that I was busy becoming the trust itself. The stage was set for the annual retreat on the island. Evelyn thought she was bringing the family together to vote me out. She didn't realize she was inviting the executioner to the final feast, and I was bringing the bill. The private island estate felt like a tomb, the air thick with the smell of expensive driftwood fires and the suffocating weight of 3 generations of arrogance. We were gathered in the Great Hall, a room designed to make outsiders feel small, but as I sat at the ivory-inlaid table, I felt a strange, cold buoyancy. Evelyn sat at the head, her silver gavel resting on the polished surface like a weapon of war. To her left, Julian sat with his shoulders hunched, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked like a man waiting for a storm to pass, unaware that he was the one standing in the center of the lightning field. The purpose of this council is clear, Evelyn began, her voice ringing out with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. The Sterling legacy is a closed system. It requires absolute loyalty and financial transparency. Isabella, you have remained a variable we can no longer account for. You have resisted the trust, you have hidden your hobbies, and you have brought a middle-class instability to this house. We have taken a vote. The white stones represent the family's future. The black stones represent your exit. She reached for the silver bowl, her fingers poised to count the tally of my humiliation. She smiled, a predatory, satisfied expression that said she had already won. She thought she was pruning a weed. She didn't realize she was trying to cut a diamond with a plastic knife. Before you count those, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a digital pulse. I think the family should see the actual state of the Sterling standard. Transparency is what you wanted, isn't it, Evelyn? I didn't wait for her permission. I tapped a key on the laptop I had brought to the table, and the massive, 90-inch screen behind her, usually reserved for displaying family crests and real estate portfolios, flickered to life. I had overridden the house's local area network hours ago, I didn't just have access to the screen, I owned the data flowing through it. The room went silent. I had presented a dual-axis financial audit, a real-time visualization of the Sterling Heritage Group's true health versus my own personal holdings. The red line, representing the Sterling's debt, their defaulted covenants, and the hemorrhaging losses from Evelyn's failed gambles, was a jagged, plummeting streak that ended in a terrifying vertical drop towards zero. Beneath it, a gray line representing Julian's net worth lay flat, a stagnant pond of inherited crumbs. Then, there was the blue line. It was my line. It represented Aegis Systems, my silent acquisitions, and the $20 million gift Evelyn had unwittingly handed me during her failed sabotage. It was a soaring, majestic curve that didn't just cross their lines, it crushed them. It made the Sterling wealth look like a footnote in a much larger, much more powerful story. "This is an error," Evelyn hissed, her face contorting as she looked at the red void where her family's fortune used to be. "This is digital trickery. Julian, tell her to turn this off." "It's not an error, Evelyn," I said, standing up. "That red line is the $400,000 Julian siphoned to pay your bridge loans. It's the $20 million you spent to buy a company I already owned. And that final drop at the end? That's Global Union Bank selling your primary mortgage notes this morning." I clicked a button, and a second document appeared, a formal notice of assignment. The name of the new creditor wasn't a bank. It was Orion Capital. My name, in bold black letters, sat at the bottom as the managing director. "I didn't just buy your debt," I whispered, the room spinning into a frantic, hushed chaos as the other family members realized they were looking at their own bankruptcy. "I bought the seat you're sitting in. I bought the gavel. I bought the very ground beneath this island." Evelyn turned back to the screen, her eyes wide, staring at the blue line that represented the woman she had forced to eat in the kitchen. She tried to speak, to conjure one last insult or one final command, but the mathematical reality was a physical weight she couldn't carry. Her hand went to her throat, her breath hitched, and for the first time in 35 years, the matriarch of the Sterling dynasty lost her composure. She collapsed back into her chair, the silver bowl of stones clattering to the floor, white and black spilling out and mixing in the dust, before she slumped sideways, her eyes rolling back as her world finally faded to black. I looked at Julian, who was staring at me as if I were a stranger he had never met. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel love. I just felt the cold, electric satisfaction of a system that had finally been debugged. The vote was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The silence that followed Evelyn's collapse was not one of grief, but of absolute, terrifying vacuum. The family council sat frozen, a collection of wax figures in designer suits, staring at the woman they had spent 5 years trying to erase. Julian was the first to move, his hands trembling as he reached toward his mother, but his eyes never left the screen where my blue line continued to hover like a predator over their ruins. I didn't wait for the paramedics. I didn't wait for the apologies that I knew would be seasoned with the bitter aftertaste of desperation. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out 2 sets of documents, crisp and cold, the final lines of code in a 5-year-long debugging process. I walked to the head of the table. Evelyn was conscious now, propped up by a cousin, her breathing ragged and thin. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the matriarch of the Sterling dynasty. I saw a squatter. I slid the first document toward her, a formal notice of foreclosure. "The bank gave me the keys, Evelyn," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "This estate, the townhouse, and the Sterling Tower are now assets of Orion Capital. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. I suggest you start with the silverware you were so worried about me touching. It might be the only thing you have left to sell." Evelyn's hand fluttered toward the paper, her fingers brushing the bold-faced legal headers as if they were hot coals. The silver gavel she had used to start the purge lay forgotten on the floor, a useless trinket from a dead era. Then I turned to Julian. He looked up at me, his face a mask of pathetic, late-blooming realization. "Isabella, we can fix this," he whispered, the same lie he'd used every time his mother had insulted me. "We're a team. My name is on those accounts too, we can." "Your name was on the accounts you used to rob our future, Julian," I interrupted, sliding the second set of papers, the divorce petition, into the space between us. "But your name isn't on the blue line. You stayed silent when she tried to exile me. You voted for a ghost. Well, now you have one." I stood tall, the weight of the sterling standard finally lifting off my shoulders. I realized then that I hadn't just bought their debt, I had bought my freedom. I was 35 years old, the daughter of a janitor who had built a fortress out of the bricks they threw at me. "The boat is waiting at the dock," I told the room, my gaze sweeping over the family that had once forced me to eat in the kitchen. "I've already settled the staff's wages for the month out of my personal account, something the Sterling Trust hasn't been able to do for weeks. They're coming with me." I turned my back on the ivory table, the spilled stones, and the man who had been too weak to love a woman who was stronger than his legacy. I walked out of the great hall, my heels clicking a rhythmic, triumphant cadence against the marble floors my father would have recognized. As the boat pulled away from the private island, I looked back at the limestone fortress. It looked smaller now, a crumbling relic of a world that didn't realize the architecture had changed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from my lead developer. Aegis 2.0 is live. The market is reacting. Valuation up another 12%. I breathed in the salt air, sharp and clean, free of the scent of old scotch and betrayal. The code of silence was broken. I wasn't just the architect of their downfall, I was the founder of my own empire. The Sterlings were left with their name and their black stones. I was left with the horizon. Please don't forget to subscribe and like this video.